Good morning. It's good to have you back. Today's Daily 15 is titled Freud on the Meaning of a Slip of the Tongue. Our source for this excerpt of Freud comes from his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. If you'd like to purchase the book or read along with us, head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. Today's Daily 15 is an excursion into one of Freud's first introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. In the lecture, Freud asks whether slips of the tongue, misplacements, or seemingly random forgettings, in fact, have a sense, he calls it, or a meaning, or have an applicable interpretation. If you want to join the conversation about this Daily 15, head on over to community.alifeofthought.com. Remember, what I say here is not supposed to be the last word. It's not supposed to be the final pronouncement about what Freud meant. No, it's supposed to be the first word. So keep the conversation going. Join us. With that being said, let's get right into paragraph 1. Freud begins, "Let us now call in someone who knows nothing of psychoanalysis and ask him how he explains such occurrences." Don't worry, I'll say what the occurrences are. His first reply will certainly be, "Oh, that's not worth explaining. They're just small chance events." What does the fellow mean by this? Is he maintaining that there are occurrences, however small, which drop out of the universal concatenation of events, occurrences which might just as well not happen as happen? If anyone makes a breach of this kind in the determinism of natural events at a single point, it means that he has thrown overboard the whole Weltanschauung of science. Even the Weltanschauung of religion, we may remind him, behaves more consistently, since it gives an explicit assurance that no sparrow falls from the roof without God's special will. I think our friend will hesitate to draw the logical conclusion from his reply. He will change his mind and say, after all, when he comes to study these things, he can find explanations of them. What is in question are small failures of functioning, imperfections in mental activity, whose determinants can be assigned. A man who can usually speak correctly may make a slip of the tongue if he is slightly indisposed and tired, or perhaps if he is excited, or, again, if he is too much occupied with other things. It is easy to confirm these statements. Slips of the tongue do really occur with particular frequency when one is tired, has a headache, or is threatened with migraine. In the same circumstances, proper names are easily forgotten. Some people are accustomed to recognize the approach of an attack of migraine when proper names escape them in this way. When we are excited, too, we often make mistakes over words, and over other things as well, and a bungled action follows. Intentions are forgotten, and a quantity of other undesigned actions become noticeable if we are absent-minded. That is, properly speaking, if we are concentrated on something else. A familiar example of this absent-mindedness is the professor in Fliegende Blätter, who leaves his umbrella behind and takes the wrong hat because he is thinking about the problems he is going to deal with in his next book. All of us can recall from our own experience instances of how we can forget intentions we have formed and promises we have made because, in the meantime, we have had some absorbing experience. Thank you, Freud. Now, I think this should all feel somewhat agreeable so far. So I want to start by honing in on what Freud is talking about here. And so that brings me to our highlighted phrase, quote unquote, such occurrences. He mentions this in the beginning. Freud, throughout this paragraph, has in mind what he calls parapraxes. And though the word can sound like a little intimidating and medical, these are supposed to be little mistakes that everyone makes. He gives examples like a slip of the tongue, and crucially, a slip of the tongue can happen either verbally, so a misspeaking of sorts, or it can happen on paper. I miswrite something. Or nowadays, I guess Freud didn't have to worry about this, I could mistype something. He also means to include things like misspellings or even inconvenient forgettings. We do this all the time, and it's perhaps the easiest example to bring in front of your mind. For instance, I forget the birthday of someone, or where I left my keys right before I'm going out to meet a person, or that I had a meeting scheduled that day. And maybe the worst thing that we all know is, you forget the person whose number you didn't save. You forget their name. And so you have to do this awkward dance of trying to figure out who they are. Those are the cases Freud is interested in. Now, at first, and Freud talks about this a little bit in the lecture itself, you might think that there's nothing to be explained here, and certainly the other things, the other potential candidate subjects of psychology are much, much, much more pressing and important. Who cares about misspeakings when we could be looking into delusions or narcissism or OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder? But what Freud wants to say is this is not like a sufficient reason to throw them to the side. There must be a reason that these things occur. And further, as a sort of methodological point, a point of method, Freud wants to say, yeah, we're not going to solve the big issues by just starting with the big issues. It helps to start with the smaller, easier to grasp phenomenon. So Freud is going to try to explain why these are so hard to account for, and then maybe why our initial gut attempts to account for them aren't as successful as we think. That brings us to today's circled phrase. Freud says, quote, "It means that he has thrown overboard the whole Weltanschauung of science." So Weltanschauung is a word that was not translated in the English edition either, but it was a fun Google search. So it means worldview. Freud means to say here then that to imagine that these things are simply random happenings that aren't in accordance with some law, either physical or psychical, is to throw overboard the scientific worldview. Well, why does he think this? It's not this. It's not a sort of deep philosophical reason. His idea is simply that these slips of the tongue, these little mistakes, can't just be random. They must have some explanation. Or in plainer, less German-infused English, it can't be that these things happen purely randomly. Freud wants to say that they have to happen in accordance with some sort of law. Every effect has a cause. Even in religion, he notes there are religious laws, and it can't be that our psychic lives are less determined or less guided by natural law than religion is, Freud wants to say. And so the challenge then becomes to explain why such things happen. And to give you a bit of a preview, Freud is eventually going to say that these slips of the tongue or forgettings or misplacements or whatever, any of these parapraxes, are related to our unconscious mind. They have a sort of meaning or an interpretation for us. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, so let's take a moment to examine what we might think immediately, what our gut explanation is. The most obvious, the most tempting explanation. And that brings us to today's underlined phrase. Freud says, "A man who can usually speak correctly may make a slip of the tongue. 1, if he is slightly indisposed and tired. 2, if he is excited. And 3, if he is too much occupied with other things." Good. Now, This is perhaps the most immediately attractive explanation. It's what comes to mind when we're first faced with Freud's question. Why do people misspeak? Why do they forget? Here's a simple and easy answer. They're tired. They're anxious. Their mind has wandered. They're dissociating. But I want to spend a moment talking about why Freud doesn't buy such a picture completely. And to do that, I'm going to ask us to go a bit beyond this paragraph because, Freud takes his time. There are a lot of paragraphs. Namely, a bit later on page 23 of my edition, Freud discusses a case in which someone is focused on their job. Their mind presumably isn't anywhere else. And this is crucial. At least it need not be anywhere else for them to make such a slip. And then we imagine they make the same mistake. He gives us a nice example. He says, quote, "A gentleman of the lower house of our parliament once opened the sitting with the words, 'Gentlemen, I take notice that a full quorum of members is present and herewith declare the sitting closed.'" Okay, so there was a slip of the tongue. He said closed instead of open. But because we're not sort of imagining him as busy, like we might imagine him as fully engaged on the job. We have a further need to explain how a slip of the tongue is possible, because we wouldn't want to say, well, for him to have made that mistake, his mind must have been somewhere else. That seems a little implausible, or at least Freud wants to say that seems a little implausible. But that aside, it's important that I say their mind need not be anywhere else. Because Freud's idea is that of such a member of parliament, we might just as well, so this is an equally acceptable interpretation, we might just as well interpret their slip of the tongue as having what he calls a sense, as having a meaning behind it, as not being a mere accident, but rather as expressing something that the member of parliament thinks in some sense, but perhaps would not be able to consciously ascribe to himself. He would not be able to, that is to say, admit that he thinks it, regardless of whether you asked him or whether he introspected and asked himself in the quiet of his mind. Freud wants to say, yes, he may be tired, but just as well, he might also be annoyed to have to be there. He might want to get this all over with. And you can make this move with many different slips of the tongue. And this isn't to say that every slip of the tongue or every forgetting, although Freud might want to maintain this, it's not exactly clear, but we need not accept it, at least, right? We could accept a more conservative idea. We need not say that every slip of the tongue, every forgetting has a meaning, but simply that they can be interpreted as having a meaning. So maybe I just forgot that person's name because I was anxious, or because I was tired, or because my mind was somewhere else. But, and this is the key insight, perhaps I forgot it because I didn't care to remember it, because I didn't like them all that much. And maybe that's something I'm able to be honest about with myself. But maybe it isn't. And I think that's Freud's point. So we'll close with our paragraph 2, which makes this a little bit more vivid. Freud says, quote, "The fact of the Parapraxes having a sense of its own seems in certain cases evident and unmistakable. When the president of the lower house with his first words closed the sitting instead of opening it, we feel inclined, in our view of knowledge of the circumstances in which the slip of the tongue occurred, to recognize that the Parapraxes had a sense, that it had a meaning. The president expected nothing good of the sitting and would have been glad if he could have brought it to an immediate end. We have no difficulty in pointing to the sense of this slip of the tongue, or, in other words, in interpreting it. Or let us suppose that one lady says to another, in tones of apparent admiration, 'That smart new hat. I suppose you aufgetatzt it.' which is in German a non-existent word, which she misspeaks in the place of aufgetutzt, which means trimmed. It yourself. Then Freud continues, no amount of scientific propriety will succeed in preventing our seeing behind the slip of the tongue the words, this hat is a patzerei, a botched up affair. That's it for Freud today. Did you agree? Did you disagree? Head on over to community.alifeofthought.com and make your thoughts known. It's entirely reasonable to think that the first explanation is right and all of this talk about sense is empty. I mean, this is exactly the point Freud is trying to argue against in his introductory lectures, which is to say it is a point that a lot of reasonable people believe. So community.alifeofthought.com, or if you want to mark up that second paragraph yourself, head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.